this conversation here tonight. If you didn't get a chance to view our yokai exhibit, please come back and do so. It will be on display until December 17th, so only a few more days. And I would also like to welcome you back to view our Lansing Bangdell exhibit, which is on display in the Grand Hall. Once again, I want to thank everybody for coming this evening and attending this program, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion. So, thank you.
Well, this comes on the heels of the Japan, Houston, Texas investment and trade mission that Mayor Turner led in October in Japan. And so that's why we're talking about climate and environment and these initiatives and best practices. And so we're bringing you this film tonight because it's one that I saw that really moved me. I went home and did everything that I could to reduce my carbon footprint, everything we could at the office. And so that's why I want to share it with you. Nathan Havey is the writer, director, and he's on a trip now abroad doing another documentary on the coffee farms and how we get coffee in the supply chain to us when we're trying to drink it. And it's a very long supply chain, so he's trying to help these farmers do blockchain. So hats off to him. But if you're so inclined, this is such a great documentary that Nathan's current position is that he wants to raise enough funds, $300,000. He's over halfway there. And so if you want to screen it, it's $10,000. And he'll come and he'll speak to people and answer questions. And what he's trying to do is raise $300,000 to actually pay back what they spent, but also to give them money for a curriculum to put it in universities and schools and vocational schools so that they can start in engineering, mechanical engineering, to start changing the way that they're thinking about making products and how can it be a reduction in their climate change and the environment. So this is our second event that we've had. The first event was in November when we came back, the third from Japan, with Christine Harada. She is the executive director of the Federal Permitting Steering Council. So she leads anything $150 million projects or more. She can help you get through 17 different agencies to push through your permitting process so that it's much quicker. So if you want her contact information, let me know. I'll be glad to put you in touch with her, because what we're all about is economic development as well, right? So we did, while we were in Japan, we saw a lot of great companies, and some of them are here tonight. Daikin is presenting. We have Sumitomo Heavy, Mitsubishi, Toshiba, and many other companies, ANA as well. So, and the government agencies, we also saw a lot of them. And at the end of our trip, besides Chiba being our 50th anniversary sister city, we actually saw the Houston Ballet perform Swan Lake in Tokyo, and that was pretty fascinating. So at 1 week, we had over 190 people in Japan from Houston, which was really great. So anyway, we want to acknowledge our sponsors tonight. So from the U.S.-Japan Council, that's the Platinum sponsors are Amazon, American Airlines, Aratani Foundation, the CBP Foundation, Deloitte, Fabit, and MUFG. They also have title sponsors like Daikin, Hitachi, Yotsuke Honju, Island Insurance Foundation, the NEC, Corporation NTT Group, Oric Shell, the Terasaki Nibei Foundation, the Tashizo Watanabe Foundation, and Toyota Research Institute. So there are many others that are a part of the U.S.-Japan Council in terms of sponsors that help us deliver programs like this around the country and in Japan. And so tonight, we're very honored to have the Consul General from Japan say a few remarks before we get started. And his name is Hirofumi Murabayashi. And he came to us from Portland and New York City. He's been in his post for 38 years, so he's well experienced and he's considered an expert on the United States. He went to school at MIT and Harvard. And so he had great postgraduate work there. And then he was previously in many countries. So when you talk about somebody being global, that's Hirofumi Murabayashi, right? So he's been in the Philippines, Pakistan, Hungary, Trinidad, Tobago, Yemen, Oman, Albania, and Malawi. So Consul General and his wife tonight, Aurora, wave, Aurora's here. And they have a daughter and a son, and they have grandchildren, and they have a new one on its way. So please help me welcome Consul General Murabayashi.
Thank you, Donna, for kind introduction, and also thank you for arranging this great event. And also thank you very much for arranging a reunion opportunity with Mr. Fred Katayama. 久しぶりです。I was looking forward to seeing you. As she mentioned, I was serving in New York more than 20 years ago as a press officer, press consul, and he was with the CNN. So we knew each other since that time, but I didn't have chance to meet with each other for many years. So I'm looking forward to talking with you later on. Yeah. So anyway, yes, I'm looking forward to watch the movie about this climate change or the efforts to counter climate change. Of course, the government of Japan is also promoting the green transformation, and we are calling on the people or the consumers to change the behavior for consuming so that we can achieve the net zero by 2050. As Donna mentioned, Mayor Sylvester Turner of the city of Houston is an avid promoter of the climate change. I mean, he gives great importance to countering the climate change. And as he mentioned, he just visited Japan in late October. And I heard that at every meeting in Japan, he declared that as the mayor of the world's energy capital, which is Houston, he will lead the world for energy transition. So from the viewpoint of the Mayor Turner or viewpoint of someone in Houston, tonight's event is really a great opportunity to learn about and to think about climate change and what we can do to counter climate change. So thank you very much, and once again, and I'm looking forward to the movie and the panel discussion later on. Thank you.
Identifying and then grooming young leaders such as Robert Gondo, who's in our audience tonight. And then we connect them with our colleagues on the other side of the Pacific in Japan and amongst our network here in the United States. And we're proud to partner with the Asia Society, among other partners, to put this event together tonight. And speaking of people to people, I felt that when Matt Fuller here gave me a great tour of this wonderful facility that was designed by Yoshio Taniguchi, who's left his imprint here in Houston as well as in New York with the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art. Well, going back to October, the U.S.-Japan Council had the honor of hosting your mayor, Sylvester Turner, as Don pointed out earlier. He spoke at the plenary of our annual conference in October. And what I remember him saying was what Don also alluded to earlier, that Houston is the world's energy capital, but in order to continue to lead, it has to lead the transition to clean energy, and that transition, he said, will have an impact on the globe. And so today, we're here to share the best practices from Houston, and by extension, the United States and Japan, and identify new areas, new technologies, new practices, and ways that we can collaborate and cooperate with each other. So with representative from Daikin on our dais today, I'm sure we'll find out firsthand how Japanese companies, or a Japanese company like Daikin, operating here in the US can help move the needle on climate change and sustainability. And in that regard, we're fortunate to have with us Nathan Walker from Daikin. He's the man in the middle there. And I'm sure many of you know, but in case you're not from Houston or not from Japan, Daikin is the world's top manufacturer of heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, what they call HVAC in the industry. It sells in more than 140 countries. And I got the sense of how big, it's funny, with Japan you get the sense of a minimalist culture and things are small. You bring them to Texas, everything becomes big. Daiking's factory that I toured yesterday, one of the third largest in the United States, fifth largest in the world. They built them 74 football fields and learned a lot. But as for Nathan, he is Senior Vice President of Environmental Business Department at Daikin Comfort, and he's helping driving Daiking's goal of steering the North American HVAC industry toward more environmentally advanced products, and we'll hear about some of that tonight. We're also pleased to have two leading consultants in the energy industry. Seating right next to my right, to your left, is Uday Turaga. He is the founder and CEO of the consulting research firm ADI Analytics. And he specializes in oil and gas, energy, chemicals, and industrials. And his clients, big ones, include Shell, Aramco, Microsoft, GE, and he knows a lot of Japanese companies as well. And Maynard Holt, on the far, to my far right, your far left. And by the way, just found out that Maynard and Nathan are both from Tennessee, where Masami Tyson just came to today, all the way over for our event. Maynard is a founder and CEO of the consulting firm Veriton, and he's also a podcaster. In fact, it was his podcast, I understand, that inspired him to develop the firm that he leads today. And that podcast is called Close of Business Tuesday. I looked it up on Apple's platform. It's got a 5-star rating, so you must be doing something right.
My relatives.
And you'll get some more fans tonight, I'm sure. But I expect a lot of you today, given that background. Now it's Close of Business Wednesday. And earlier in his career, he was at Goldman Sachs in energy and power. And so I want to start off, since we have the pleasure, Donna introduced us that wonderful, inspiring document. I hope you guys are as inspired as I was. But as we saw Ray Anderson of Interface, he recognized what his company was doing. He called himself a legal thief and a plunderer of the earth. And we saw him how he did a 180. And he showed that his employees, as well as that, the Japanese owner of a hotel, how they could change their ways, how they could cut waste, and also cut costs at the same time. What was amazing to me was how he changed that corporate culture with that tomorrow's child in mind, and as a result, companies like Nike and Boeing, Walmart started coming to him, and even developing fishing nets in the Philippines that could be reused for other purposes. But today, in that same vein, we hope to learn from each other as well. And so I want to start with the documentary, and since you're specialists in this industry and also on sustainability, I'd like to start by asking each of you, what did you learn today that you didn't know before? Or is there something, as Donna herself mentioned today, that inspired her to say, I'm going to change my ways? What did you learn, Donna?
Yeah, so first of all, right, very inspiring movie, beautiful story, right? And frankly speaking, I hadn't heard of Interface or Ray Anderson until I saw the film. So, just knowing about him to me was a fairly inspiring thing. A couple of things that stood out for me. Number one is, I think there is this desire that is driven by a moment in time where you come across a book that tells you that, okay, we need to rethink the way we are going about business, industry, manufacturing, and about our lives on this planet, and to leave something for the next generation. But that, to take that moment and convert that into a passion and then drive it for 20 years to the point where your legacy sustains through multiple rounds of leadership, I think that's a challenging, and that in many ways is the enduring part of this, right? And I think it's a great blueprint for how do you drive that through these organizations.
It's not just talking the talk, it's walking the walk and actually doing it. And Nathan, you're at a huge corporation, selling in 140 countries around the world.
Right.
And you're in charge of the environmental business unit. So we saw how Ray, I guess, changed the culture of that company. And he said, it's every single person. We saw the person on the line. How did that hit you?
It spoke to me very deeply, and just a little bit of background. The role of the environmental business development, and we call it internally the Environmental Promotion Office, began April 1st. And so this is a relatively new initiative. But watching this movie brought home some of the ways that I know that our department can get things done inside the company. So our chairman, who was Hiro Tomita, who was talking to me a little over a year ago about forming this group and challenging Daikin North America to be the most environmentally advanced company in the HVAC industry. And he's laying that challenge out in front of me, and he said something to me that I didn't understand at the time. But I never forgot it, and it's been a challenge to me. He said, through an interpreter, Nathan, we will never be the environmentally advanced company we have to be until every employee cares about the environment and takes action about the environment. And it's always been in the back of my mind, and we're building towards that, but watching this movie, watching the transformation happen top down, but by the time 25 years later, the key employees wouldn't entertain a business strategy that wasn't an environmental business strategy. My mind is spinning. I've got members of the team here today, and I hope their mind is spinning on how we can transform what we watched to make every employee care about the sustainability, the environmental advancement, and make it a core part of our culture. So I was very inspired by that.
I think they're saying, that each employee, everyone across any division who gets hired has to go through at least, 3 sessions or training, so that it's really embedded in that culture. Maynard, did
Yeah.
something jump out at you that you thought, wow, Nirvana moment?
Well, there were, when you see, I've had the benefit of seeing a lot of companies over the years, and so you see how they're put together and how they work, how they communicate, how they make decisions. So I guess what I saw in the movie is what a high quality company looks like. Right? It has strong leadership, it has great communication, information flows freely. It has leadership with a purpose. The purpose doesn't necessarily have to be we're going to solve climate change, but it needs to be a higher purpose. And so I think the first thing I noticed is there were just key elements of a good company in the video. I thought the other one that was pretty fascinating was the whole thing seems to have started because they lost the sale. And in your average company, if you lose a sale, the CEO doesn't hear about it. The CEO has a lot of stuff going on. Somebody's in charge of sales, somebody's in charge of this, that, and the other. But you could tell from his, the way he was wired, he even said this, he said, each sale is like another heartbeat.
Yeah.
So when they lost that California project, I was amazed that he knew. There's a lot of companies that doesn't happen. And then the second thing I was amazed by is he was bothered, he was bothered by it. He didn't just know, he was bothered by it. And he dug into it. And of course, then, that's when all the changes started happening. So I just think that's, what I notice is, there are companies who are highly connected to the world, and management, if something happens, boy, they feel it. And then there are other companies that they don't feel it, either because they're not a retail business, they don't sell to they sell wholesale, so you always notice this difference. A retail company understands how people think much better than a wholesale company. But anyway, I was struck by that. They had a very customer-oriented culture. And usually good companies have CEOs who are very engaged with the customers. They know what the customers want. I just thought also, last part, and I'll stop talking on this, or I'll surrender my first turn. There were stages of the movie, right? There was the initial observation, and we're starting to study it, and then they moved to the sort of the next phase, and then you could tell it dawned on a lot of people in the money that, like in the movie, that hey, we could make more doing this, and that's great. The profit motive is great, and so there was a period of the profit motive, and then there was the transition to the second CEO. And when he said the chips were down and we decided to roll the dice on the $10 million, and one of the guys said, if you don't do this, everything we've told the people about what we're trying to do, you're going to lose your credibility. So there was the importance of authentic leadership, walking the walk. So I thought that was a key moment. And then that third stage where they took on climate, that's a new phase, and that's where I think the biggest debate is still happening, is what can companies do in that arena? What should companies do? What actually helps? What's greenwashing? That phase was sort of like movie part 3, and that's sort of distinct from the first 2. But I thought it was a fabulous movie.
Well, Maynard, you talked about, the profit motive. That sort of reminded me of the mantra that we hear nowadays in corporate America, that diversity is good for business, and that's sort of becoming diverse. And it's sort of, that sustainability has to get to that point, is good for business, and that's what we're all in for it.
Can I tell you a comment on that, Fred, that I think is really interesting?
All right.
There is technology that makes you a lower cost provider. And that is sustainability that's enhancing your profitability. There's another kicker in there, which is because I am sustainable, because I do this in a certain way, I can charge you more. Somebody likes that. And that's sort of a different element, because that's a sentiment that customers have versus just a costing. So it's interesting that it has 2 components. When they did the solar-powered tiles, and then they had to sail to California, because California said, I want those solar-powered, So it's fascinating when we get into the profit motive, because a lot of decisions businesses can make might be because it's cost, but it also might be because it's sentiment.
So I'm wondering if any of you felt, what hit me also was how this company turned to nature for the solutions. That let's see how they did it, and maybe we can replicate it. Whether it's the not having to use a glue and using gravity instead. Have you heard about, are other companies doing this?
Yeah, so I started my career in R&D, right? I got my PhD from Penn State, went to ConocoPhillips, was in R&D for 6 years there. And I would say that not enough companies do this, right? In fact, Clean Tech 1.0, many of you will probably remember this, but there were lots of companies that were funded in and around biofuels, bio-based chemicals, and a lot of them were trying to borrow ideas from nature. They were saying, okay, how does nature make these sponges that are that have such high surface areas, that have such high porosities, and why are we not able to replicate them in the lab? And then there are professors around the world trying to replicate that, and then take those materials and put them into traditional chemical processes and petrochemical processes and try to make them better, or try to make them work with bio-based chemicals. But all that innovation happened outside the traditional Fortune 500 companies, right? It didn't necessarily happen with the large companies. Now, of course, a lot of those companies, capital flowed into those companies, either through the form of corporate venturing groups and all of that. But it did happen, and I don't think it's still happening to the extent that we'd like to see. And some of that is just the way organizations are structured, right? That large companies are designed to run their innovation and R&D groups focused on generating that small incremental improvement in their operations, but they are not necessarily incentivized to have a bunch of guys out there running around thinking, like, what is it that we are working on 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now? I think that whole mindset existed in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but it started collapsing, at least in the industries that I'm very familiar with, oil and gas, energy, chemicals, through the 80s and the 90s.
So you saw that more at the smaller company level, whereas in this particular case, Interface was itself a Fortune 500 company doing this.
Yeah, it's not clear to me whether they were already that big when they started on the journey. I mean, it felt to me that a lot of Interface's DNA was altered at a relatively younger stage in its journey, and as a result, it was able to kind of keep that, right? It was able to have people who were willing to challenge a new CEO and say that, hey, if you want to live up to Ray's legacy, we just can't greenwash this. You can't move the sustainability function into marketing. It has to be the next big mountain that we need to climb, which is climate change and how do you develop carbon negative materials and all of that stuff.
Right, and they know which direction they gotta climb.
Yeah.
Fred, for just as background, I think the company, I was just taking a look at it, it's about a $600 million company today. And it looks like at its peak, it was maybe 3 or 4. But I would say as companies go, that's a small company. So you would definitely put them in the innovative group, not that, massive, large group.
Yeah, they're saying in the documentary itself, Fortune 500, so that's an 80 wonder, but thanks for clarifying that. Nathan, I want to ask you, so at Daikin, what are you doing in Houston, products-wise, that is gonna help the world combat climate change?
I want to maybe quote the documentary, and I want to read it, and I'm very pleased that the notes I took in the dark, I can still read most of them, because I wasn't sure about that. But he made a statement that was abandon the comfort of the status quo. And I wrote that one down because I think that embodies what Daikin would like to do here in the United States, which is change the status quo of how we, as an HVAC industry, provide heating and cooling solutions to people and businesses, and also how people think about heating and cooling. And I'll highlight in a way that is more sustainable, in a way that does promote environmentally friendly technologies. I'll highlight a couple of them. And I know you, through the tour, saw quite a bit of this, but and I'd encourage us all to think about this, to think about how our homes are made comfortable and the environmental impact of those technologies. And so the majority of single-family homes in the U.S. are heated by a gas furnace. And that is either natural gas or propane that runs through a tube and is basically set on fire. And of course, the burning of fossil fuels creates emissions. And what Daikin wants to change that paradigm to heat pumps. Heat pumps are fairly ubiquitous globally. They're used somewhat sparingly here, and they're used differently here in the U.S. than I think they can be used. I am a recovering engineer, so I'll try not to get too technical on how these things work. But ultimately, what a heat pump does is it extracts the heat that is in the air, that is in the ambient atmosphere around it, and moves that heat indoors. And so in a way, and it's classified like this in Europe, it's a renewable energy source. The heat in the air. Our atmosphere is heated by the sun. That heat, even at very cold degrees, is still in the air. The heat pump uses vapor compression, uses a compressor to move that heat, even in cold conditions, inside the home. And that's a renewable energy source. And that is a study done by UC Davis, that the emissions of a heat pump system over all of the United States taking an average. 40% less emissions than a gas furnace system. But the good news about the heat pump is it runs on electricity, so it's electrification, decarbonization. And so as the grid cleans, as we use more renewable energy sources, the heat pump becomes a better and better alternative to the gas furnace. So by 2040, likely climbs from the 40% decrease in emissions to 60% decrease in emissions as we have cleaner and cleaner energy. So that's technology number one, is we want the United States to adopt that technology in ways that other geographies already have. And the second is both on the AC, on an air conditioner, and on a heat pump for the heating side, is the utilization of inverter compressors, which again are ubiquitous in Asia and in Europe. But we have a challenge here in the U.S. that the U.S. is where air conditioning was invented. It's almost a 100-year-old industry here. And so the comfort of the status quo absolutely exists in our industry. And the vast majority of air conditioners that we all have, I think of it like a car. If it's got to go 100 miles, the air conditioners today turn on and go as fast as they can, and then they turn off and on. The inverter compressor is a little more like cruise control. It matches the output to the load on the house. So on an 80-degree day, it's running very slowly, very as efficiently as possible. On a hot day, it speeds up. And so we might be programmed to think when the unit's off, that's the least amount of the least amount of energy that can be consumed. But that on-off is very, very inefficient.
So it's sort of like traffic in a car, stop and go. In regular street traffic, you might be using more gas than on the highways where you're always going smoothly. It's always on.
Always on, always on. When there is a need for heating or cooling, it's always on, and maybe on very, very low, but that's tremendously more efficient than on-off. And we want to make that technology the status quo here. Today it's not, but we're on our way to do that.
And so it's ubiquitous in Asia and Europe. I just read an article in the New York Times this week about Germany, how in demand these heat pumps were, given the current energy crisis it's facing. And you already said that it's 40% less in terms of emissions. It's also cheaper to operate. Then why then do we Americans not adopt them? What's the big stumbling block? And I've seen articles about why they're better, why they're more efficient. Why can't we get over that hump?
There are many reasons. One of the reasons, if you compare this market to China, where China has been for the last 20 years a construction-oriented market. But again, our being the oldest AC culture in the world, 80% of the market is replacement. So an existing structure, an existing home. The gas furnace goes out. The consumers don't always think, well, what's my best alternative? What's my most environmentally friendly solution? What's the best thing long-term for me to put in here? They call up a contractor and say, my furnace is out. And so a contractor says, I can replace a furnace. And so we've got education at the consumer level that needs to happen. We have education at the installing contractor level that needs to happen. And it's not going to change overnight. But with training and focus, as well as regulation, I think that will change.
Maynard, do you see it that way, that heat pumps here in America would be an ideal solution, or
Well, no,
we're hearing from
yeah, I
industry
think the
reps here?
technology is very exciting. And I think what's interesting is when you pull back from all this, because at some level you have everybody's trying to do what they can do. And then you have a sense of it is a global problem, and you're trying to impact a global problem. So for instance, my sometimes I don't mean to be chirpy, but what we're not, the world's problem is we don't need to clean up Connecticut. I don't know why I always say Connecticut.
Rhode Island.
But Connecticut's pretty clean. It's pretty clean. And I think one of the things that Uday, if you're around oil and gas, you're around a concept called finding costs. And the finding cost concept, whether you're looking for a barrel of oil or you're looking for a ton of CO2, the finding cost concept is go get the cheapest ones you can. So if you have $1, go get as much greenhouse gas with that dollar as you can. So I think where we get lost in the climate debate as a society is people start to say, you should buy my plant-based beef because it's better than agriculture. Maybe. You have to go through and look, it depends on a lot of things, maybe. And I'm just taking that extreme example. But, okay, but if we're going to solve it, and if it's as serious as the way we talk about it, then natural gas furnaces are not the problem. Heating oil is the problem. Right? Like heating oil, for instance, 28% in New England last winter, that was their fuel to get through the winter. This is much dirtier than natural gas, right? Much dirtier. So it's interesting. You have to drive innovation. You have to embrace change. Everybody's got to do all they can do. But at the same time, you have to have a sense, I think, from our policymakers and from our public discussion, a sense of proportion. Because, my favorite example is somewhere in the world, there is the world's dirtiest coal plant. It's out there. We tried to find it. We think it's in Poland. Okay? It provides about a third of the country's power. So you better have an idea before you take it offline. Because what we've also learned here in the last 2 years is there's another very serious problem, which is when people don't have power. So it's fascinating to try to mix the debate of sort of what we're all doing individually and as organizations and as companies and what we're doing as policymakers. One of the things we love to say in our podcast is if you would like to save the world, you should start by saving the conversation. To get people oriented to, hey, what's really the problem? Where are the big emissions? And how, if you're going to attack it, attack the big stuff first. Because we don't have limitless resources. We've got to spend efficiently.
If I could just maybe follow up on that, I think that makes a lot of sense at the policy level, right? It makes no sense to impose, as an example, a big penalty on methane emissions with the producers in the Permian or here in the various shale plays here, when you have a significant amount of the Northeast continue to use heating oil, heavy oil for heating purposes, right? And we actually just published a blog where we said that the energy crisis is not just happening in Europe. There's an energy crisis brewing actually here in the Northeast because they are likely to run out of heating oil and potentially even gas that's coming in. So I think at the policy level that makes a lot of sense, but I think just for pure competitive reasons, companies have to continue to keep innovating, right? I mean, you might have the most fuel efficient car out there, but every year you've got to go look for like, okay, how do I lightweight this car more? How do I get that 1.5% in fuel economy? Because otherwise you'll get blindsided very quickly by somebody who has been tinkering along and generates, over 5 years a compounded rate of return on that fuel economy.
No, and I completely agree. Innovation is the way forward. And there was another quote in the movie which was great. One of the managers said, the rule was, if it was the same or cost less, we're doing it. So I just use the heat pump example because that's where we started. When these guys drive those heat pump prices to 50% of a furnace, or when they keep driving them down, like that's how you change markets. What we have to be sensitive to from a policy perspective is if we don't push solutions on people, which drive up costs.
And given those costs then, and Daikin for a heat pump for the equivalent of what would be a gas furnace, what's the price differential now at the residential level?
It's a bit of a complicated question because the equipment itself is only a portion of the cost. And so what a residential owner faces, the actual installation costs are going to be higher than the equipment costs. So if it were a retail experience where you're just buying right there on the shelf and that were the only cost you incurred, it wouldn't be terribly different. But it is a challenge for a home to switch from gas heating to electric heating. I think there are ways to mitigate that with increases in technology. But at the moment, that's probably one of the more larger barriers.
Or incentives needed from the government?
Absolutely, the Inflation Reduction Act is a big part of that. I'm not crazy about some of the levels that the government set for the Inflation Reduction Act. There's up to $2,000 to a homeowner to help mitigate some of that for a heat pump of a certain efficiency level.
I want to turn to keep on this technology theme then. Uday, you've worked with a lot of Japanese companies. What are some of the technological innovations, advances that you've seen from Japanese companies that you think should be employed here in the United States that we don't know about?
Yeah, I mean, so
That you can reveal.
So, I mean, if I just take a step back, right? I mean, we probably worked with over 25, 30 Japanese companies over the last 13, 14 years that ADI has been around. We do a lot of technology assessment where clients will come to us and say, here's a technology that we have developed to make hydrogen at the smaller scales. Can you help us define what the market looks like? What are the sweet spots? Who's the first set of 10 likely customers? So we do that kind of work. And we have done those kinds of projects in hydrogen, LNG, batteries, energy storage, biofuels, new materials, polymers, plastics. We've done, increasingly we're doing a lot of work in and around energy transition. So, materials recycling, critical materials, materials extraction, wastewater treatment. So we see a lot of new technology that's coming out of Japan.
Such as?
In all of these areas, there's some very interesting technology that Japanese companies have developed in and around hydrogen generation at smaller scales. We have not seen similar technologies in North America, for example. Of course, the drivers are very different, right? North America has a lot of natural gas that's available very cheaply. We think that for the next 30 years, natural gas in the US is going to be available. The finding costs are less than $1 an MCF, right? But those drivers, Japan's always been resource constrained, and for them energy is a big part of the mix, and therefore you've seen a lot of innovation there. But we've seen very interesting technologies in hydrogen generation at micro, smaller scales from a wide range of fuels. We've seen very interesting technologies in squeezing out greater efficiency of biofuels production from the same amount of biomass. And the US and North America has some interesting technologies here as well. But what we are seeing is a greater level of efficiency in extracting calories out of biomass, for example, to make biofuels. We just did a due diligence piece for a client that invested in a battery recycling company. And this is a very new battery recycling technology, and the first of its the first of our kind plant using that technology was actually in Japan. So I mean, those are some examples, right? I mean, this might sound odd, but I've always thought that the Japanese and the Texans are in many ways similar. When they get their minds around a specific thing, they can actually move very quickly. I mean, people don't realize, but before Fukushima, until Fukushima happened, Japan had about 54 nuclear reactors that were on stream. Japan got into thinking about nuclear energy only in the mid-50s. And I think the first regulatory agency that was established was in like 1954 or something. But the first demonstration reactor was running in 1957. So in 3 years, they went and said, okay, we're going to make this happen. And they got that done. A similar story in LNG, right? The LNG industry today exists primarily because there was somebody in Japan who went and evangelized the technology and said that we're going to make this happen. It was not easy because you had to completely change. I mean, there's a lot of investment in infrastructure and all of that stuff. So when we look at what's happening in the oil patch here and how quickly the entire thing was scaled up, I've always felt that it's very similar in that commitment and the doggedness to drive things forward that I see between these two parts of the world.
And Nathan, is there anything that you're doing at Daikin? Products, well, we talked about products, perhaps even manufacturing-wise, that would be wise for we Americans to adopt.
Yeah, certainly. I'll talk a little bit about what we call Looped by Daikin, or the Daikin Loop system in Europe, which is something I'm kind of working on the front end of it. And it really relates to the Beyond Zero. I very much enjoyed the recycling of the carpet tiles and putting those in new products, because at the end of the day, a circular economy, it's better to reuse, right? It's better to reuse and recycle. And so, unfortunately, in air conditioning around the world, at the moment, one of the larger sources of emissions is the refrigerant inside the compressor, inside the heat exchangers. And also, unfortunately, in end of life, a lot of that refrigerant escapes to the atmosphere. And that's something we want to correct. So Loop by Daikin in Europe started to harvest the most common refrigerant at the time, R-410A. And use it in the manufacturing of new equipment. And that started, I believe, in 2018 as the F-gas regulations in Europe pushed down the availability of R-410A. They were able to continue to build VRV, which is a very good energy-saving technology, all with recovered gas, and they continue to expand that program. Now we're starting here on the front end of that with what we call refrigerant recovery, of getting the gas back. We're not to the point yet we're going to use it in manufacturing. I hope to be there, probably later in this decade. But I did pull some numbers just this year. We started the program this year, and these aren't numbers I carry around in my head, but we've collected about 12,000 pounds through our distribution network, which is the equivalent of taking over 2,000 cars off the road, of not letting that gas out of the atmosphere. And we're just getting started with that program. But thinking about the circular economy and the extended producer responsibility, and how we can not just take ownership over the product once we ship it, but ownership over all of the raw materials and components that are used to put it together and put it back to use instead of continuing to use virgin materials.
And Major, I want to shift the topic from technologies over to practices. What practices are there that we implement here in the U.S. that Japan could use more of?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're delightful to have me. I'm not a Japan expert. You probably are doing all this.
Or things that the U.S. excels
But
in?
the things that I've seen is that, much like the documentary, is entrepreneurial companies, they figure stuff out. They crack the code. The example that we're all used to in Houston maybe doesn't get talked about enough as a true, like, an industrial, a revolutionary thing, but it was the shale revolution. And so in the energy business that I grew up in, you mentioned I was at Goldman, the only thing we knew for sure was that the U.S. was using more and more natural gas every year, and every year we had less and less of it. So we were on this strange collision course where our favorite fuel was getting in, it was less and less in supply. And everybody thought, gosh, we gotta build a huge gas pipeline to Alaska, maybe we need to revive nuclear. I mean, you know, everybody does like this. But these entrepreneurial companies, really through the magic of, if they figure it out, they're gonna be incredibly well rewarded, if they could crack the code. So you had these private companies, private money, private land. You know, the incentive was there because the gas prices went to $15, which is, so the US system, which embraces private enterprise so strongly for its innovation, particularly at these smaller company levels, that's a wonderful system. You know, it has everything you saw at Interface, where they're working together and sharing and common mission, because you can't have a small company where everybody's not on the same page. This doesn't work. You could tell there were times in the course of that movie where there was enough financial pressure where, you know, things could, you know, go really wrong. So, I mean, I love that system. I know it probably sounds a little trite, but it did produce, when I used to travel in Asia, and you'd be in China in particular, and they'd say, does your country even realize what you guys did? Meaning we lowered our energy costs dramatically, and we cut our emissions with all that natural gas. So I am a big fan of market incentives. I think we do that pretty well. Because then you just let people figure it out. You know, like Nathan's got people working all night, they're gonna just keep doing all this great stuff. But I get excited about that.
We were talking on the phone about this topic about practices, and you were marveling about Halliburton Labs.
Yeah, well, you're nice to say marveling. It's like a commercial for my friends at Halliburton Labs. What's interesting, and Uday was hitting on this, and this is a fascinating sort of cultural thing. Most engineering, or most oil and gas companies, energy companies, and probably a lot of those big Japanese companies, you know, engineering companies that with engineering cultures, they like to have stuff organized. They like to have stuff in boxes. You know, Nathan is in charge of new energy and Uday is in charge of old energy. And that's you know, you tend to put stuff in boxes. And the reality is you want this messy culture, like Interface, where the CEO is just saying stuff, because the CEO is really the only person in the company that can do that. You can't do that if you're number 2 through 20. And usually in a company, you don't want to take that career risk, but the CEO takes it, can drive it. So what I noticed that's interesting about, in our conversations with Halliburton, go back a few years, but you would notice, supposedly, you know, again, it was like supposedly climate change was the world's biggest problem, but no private investor was really spending money on it. Now, it had a lot to do with the first time they tried, they failed miserably, they lost billions of dollars, and so they said, okay, let's don't do that again. But what's interesting about a company, and Halliburton is obviously a big company, you know, they have like 1,000 PhDs at the company. They have 8 labs. They're in 82 countries. But the question is, how do you tap into all that, like Interface did? How do you tap into all that? And so what Halliburton Labs is, they said, look, we're not going to spend money on startups because we're not venture capital guys. We don't really know how to do that. We're not structured that way. But we do have all this expertise. And some of these small companies, if they want to come and basically live with us, we'll help them with their engineering, we'll help them with their scaling, we'll help them with their all kinds of the ability to really take the company and have it become impactful. You know, take it from 20 people with a good idea and some revenues to something. So they invest in the company through their skills. And I think you mentioned, Fred, that, you know, what do Japan and Texas have in common? I was listening to Uday, he hit all the great points, but I think they're both engineering cultures. They're both mechanical, you know, hard tech cultures, like an energy system. And too often in the West, we think about technology and, we're gonna do an app. My joke is if today's world was the early 1900s, we wouldn't have replaced horse and buggies. You just have an app that gets the most efficient horse and buggy. It tells you the emissions from the horse and buggy. But, so we got to invest in hard tech, like real stuff, like pipes, metal, engineering, LNG, things that are like that. So I think the two cultures around that, it's fabulous, and Halliburton is that kind of culture. But that's their answer to innovation.
No, because that's been a problem for Japan, is getting a lot of startups off the ground. It's one of the big things that's an issue there. So that's why I was interested in Halliburton. You also mentioned about how the US and Japan, what's similar is they have engineering cultures. But at the same time, even though both have engineering cultures, I often wonder, how perfect does a thing have to be before it gets to market? With software, we saw with Microsoft, okay, it has a little bugs, but you throw it out there anyway, we'll improve it along the way. Whereas with the Japanese, there's that pursuit of perfection. And that's when it reminded me of what we were talking about over the phone, about getting something to market. And if there's something that Japan can emulate from the US, you're saying perhaps it's moving faster on things.
Yeah, I mean, I never want to tell somebody, especially as an immigrant who came to the US and then became a citizen here, I never want to tell somebody else in another country how they should do things, but definitely,
You're neutral.
but we definitely see great technology, and that's definitely something that's different, right? I think the agile way, as they call it in modern management jargon, right, is that you take your idea, get it to the first minimum viable product, some proof of concept, and throw it out there, and then let customers tell you, if you did this, then I would like it better, and then you kind of tweak it and improve that. While we have a lot of clients who have great technology that has been developed in Japan, and they want to perfect it to the point where there are no flaws before they put it out there. And the challenge is that sometimes if you're not first to the market, right, there's a limited share of the market that you're going to get. And imperfect technology that gets the job done is going to take market share versus the ideal technology that's out there. So yeah, I mean, I think that's.
Yeah, I was talking to a senior executive at one of America's largest industrial companies. He had taken a trip to Japan. He came back, and over dinner, he was telling us, I was shocked at just how much amazing technology they have in Japan. But what shocked me is, why don't I know about it? And he said, and this is one of America's largest companies, one of the most trusted companies, and this is what this senior executive was telling me. So that a lot.
But Fred, just to kind of follow up on that, right? I mean, this is not something that can be generalized, right? I mean, a great example is when I was at ConocoPhillips, I spent 2 years developing the company's future fuel strategy, and as part of that, we visited a number of automakers because at the end of the day, right, our customer was the automaker. We needed to understand what were the next generation of engines that they were developing so that we could develop the right set of fuels for them. And this was 2003, 4, 5, right? We were just, and I don't know if you remember, but in the Clinton administration, there was this partnership for a new generation vehicle. The idea was to develop the internal combustion engine that will get you 80 miles to a gallon of fuel. And there was a lot of technologies that came out of the national labs here in the US. Cylinder deactivation. So now if you take a car and your car, you stop at a stoplight and you see that the noise goes down because it feels like the engine has stopped. That's cylinder deactivation that came out of the partnership, the PHEV program. And there were a lot of these small innovations, start-stop technology. A lot of these innovations that came out of that the Japanese OEMs very quickly integrated it into their cars, the Toyotas, the Hondas, the Nissans. And in comparison, the American OEMs struggled to get them commercialized. So, you can't generalize this. Some of this is a function of companies, some of this is a function of innovation cultures, but there are enough examples on both sides of that.
Thanks for making that point. overgeneralization is always dangerous. Maynard, I want to ask you, we talked about natural gas, and of course, LNG is really the watchword today, given the situation in Europe with Ukraine, and the Europeans wanting more of it, given their energy crisis. But then Japan is a big buyer, probably one of the biggest buyers in the world, one of the top LNG importers. And they and the rest of Asia want more of it. So what should the U.S. be doing as an ally at this point?
I think because the situation is obviously, it's really serious. And so I think, and I think the administration is doing a number of things, for sure. But you would be pretty intense about approving infrastructure and getting it built to get more LNG on the water. You would do that, and you would facilitate that also by having natural gas pipelines that need to be built here in the U.S. You would do anything and everything possible to just get more volumes. And what we are facing in the country, and it's fascinating because this is a phenomenon across every flavor of energy. Every one. Classic, new, everything in between. You cannot get a permit to do anything. You cannot get a permit for a windmill. You cannot get a permit for the solar installation. You cannot get a permit for the pipeline. You can't get the permit for the new church. You can't get a permit. You can't get a permit. And it's because our system is antiquated, and a lot of there are just a lot of forces allied against stopping anything, stopping any progress like that. So that's a broader issue. You asked the natural gas question, I threw in the permitting thing, but the permitting thing, you mentioned our podcast, it was fascinating to me. We had a environmentalist named Ted Nordhaus come on. And Ted Nordhaus said, it was a great quote, he said, "This is not a regulatory problem, this is a deregulatory problem. What we need, because we have this great IRA, we have all this money coming, and there's a lot of good that will come from it, but you have got to get the government out of the way of the physical infrastructure progress, because if you don't do that, you're not only going to not help our allies, you are going to slow down the energy transition. You're going to put more CO2 and GHG in the air than you would if you move faster. So that's a real big issue, and I think so. It's the natural gas answer, but it's really the answer for a lot of things.
And before I go to the audience for questions, I want to ask, one of the themes in that documentary was how each and every one of you has to think in terms of sustainability. And so in the documentary, we even saw early on, we're told when the employees had that powwow at that hotel in Hawaii, that they learned that only take the food that you want to eat, that you need to eat, so that you avoid waste, to open up the windows and use less or not use air conditioning, or simple things such as leave towels on the rack instead of expecting them to be washed. Since you deal with the residential market as well as the commercial market, Nathan, the way you see it, what can an individual do to cut waste, to lessen the carbon footprint?
Being a 25-year air conditioning and heating guy, I'll certainly think through that paradigm, but I think actually the analogy of only taking the food you're going to eat is a good one, and actually can balance some standard practices in Japan versus here. I think there's some short-term things we can all do as we think about the homes in which we live. I think of an air conditioning system and the emissions potential. There's source emissions, the emissions it takes to create the energy to power the home. And so there are things we each can do to reduce those emissions by reducing the load. And so in Japan, as many here would know, there's a common application of air conditioning called a multi-split, where each room has a separate air conditioning head. And so the rooms that aren't in use shut down. They may shut down on a motion sensor, they may shut down on a timer. And if the family is just in the living space, the living room and the kitchen, that's what is being made comfortable there. As Americans with a ducted system, the vast majority of us, our entire house is hot or cold all the time. And the kids might be at school all day. Or even a lot of us may have a guest room. So you can start by saying which rooms aren't in use and shut down the vents. If you have a guest room, wait till the guest comes over to open the vent, to not be putting unneeded energy into that. And then there's some great technology in controls, in thermostats today. And so if you don't have a programmable thermostat, I think that's a pretty easy way to say, hey, the house isn't occupied from 8 in the morning to 5 in the evening, so why keep it 73, 74 degrees, and then program it to get cool just as you come home. Those little things add up over time. And even now, there's a lot of them have geofencing. So if there's just a couple of cars and they know where your phone is, well, now you're 20 miles from home, we're gonna start cooling the home down. And so those little things everybody could do can really add up. And then obviously when the unit is time to be replaced, to be thinking about things like inverters and heat pumps and how you could have a lower footprint, not just at the source, but at the site.
And when I was touring Daikin yesterday, what I also learned that in the future, they show this futuristic technology where everyone wears some sort of device, and that it localizes the temperature based on where you are in a room, and that just that area where you're sitting or standing is attuned to your temperature. When you move somewhere else, that temperature moves with you. And I thought, wow, that's really localization. But at this point, I'd like to throw the questions over to you, to the audience. If any of you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. Tell us, identify yourself, and if possible, name the person that you'd like to direct your question. Any hands? Back there. Do I see a hand back there? Yes, just a scratch. I can't see, it's sort of dark, or are you just scratching your head? Scratching your head. All right, gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Wonderful panel. My name is Yu Chang. I work for Mitsubishi Corporation. I just want to hear some of your colors around how you think about importing energy from U.S. to Japan, right? As we think about LNG as a bridging fuel, a lot of people say, what about in terms of ethanol or methanol or even electrofuels in terms of sustainable aviation fuel type? But any insights would be great. Thank you.
And one
To any gentleman.
I could throw out an observation, which is really fascinating. If this Sunday I watched 60 Minutes for the first time in like years. The French president was on. He was talking about meeting with Macron, or meeting with Biden, I mean. And he said, my number one issue is this IRA thing. Like you would have said, thought he'd say Ukraine, or there were so many issues he could have said. And he said, the IRA. And this is something that's going on, which is pretty fascinating. But the U.S., with that IRA legislation, has put so much money into the system, so many incentives. Use U.S. jobs, build it here, we'll pay for the hydrogen. I mean, it's a massive thing. And it is pulling projects that might have been built in other parts of the world to the U.S. So I think that's just kind of the interesting reality. But I think it goes to your question, which is we have people showing up saying, I want to build an ammonia plant. I want to build a, insert whatever it is. I want to do minerals mining. I want to do a lot of stuff. And they had been talking about it somewhere else, and they're now going to do it here. So the possibility that we add other flavors to our exports of energy because of the IRA seems high to me. And so, I mean, ammonia and things like that, which is basically, you know, how you transport hydrogen. These types of things could definitely happen. And Europe was already facing super high energy costs, and a lot of companies there would have been worried about staying there, like, you know, fertilizer plants, you pick it. So the possibility that the US has a massive dose of additional industrialization, more energy production, and is doing more things with our friends, I think it's quite high.
Yeah, we're referring to Macron. That's, for example, the auto industry has really been affected by that because of production.
If you're an industrial company, and that's what I mentioned that Chinese quote where they said, does your country realize what you did? But when you have low energy costs, that's probably the number one competitive advantage thing. It's right there with labor. And so for an industrial company to have its energy costs double and to try to compete on the world stage, it's so the U.S. is from a competitive landscape standpoint, the U.S. is going to do a lot of stuff here and grow a lot and do a lot that you wouldn't have predicted otherwise.
Yeah, so just to build on that, one of the things that I think about is that the traditional model of how do you evaluate the relative competitiveness of different regions is comparative advantage, right? And energy, natural gas in particular, is North America's comparative advantage today. And it's a comparative advantage that's not going to go away. The only way it goes away is if you see more and more countries start thinking of natural gas as a fuel that is similar to coal and not as this bridge fuel, as this fuel that's going to get us through the energy transition future. And to that end, I think what we are seeing today is not just ways to improve the finding cost of natural gas, but also to improve the sustainability footprint or the externalities associated with natural gas, right? Capturing all these fugitive emissions, making North American natural gas the cleanest form of natural gas out there, which is what a lot of companies are working on right now, pretty aggressively, enables LNG's competitiveness in the long term.
And staying on the LNG theme, given the issues that Japan's now facing, are there opportunities for Japanese companies in this regard, on the flip side?
Yeah, Maynard was making a great point, right, earlier when he said that the cultural, the general theme across people in the US is we're going to oppose infrastructure of all kinds. It doesn't matter whether it is offshore wind or it is solar or it is pipelines into the Northeast. There's just opposition for everything, right? I see similar things in Japan, right? Like now there's tremendous opposition to nuclear power. There's lots of things that you can learn from Fukushima. There's a lot of things that need to be learned about why it took so long to define adequate strategies around fuel, waste fuel management when you've been operating these nuclear reactors for 30, 40 years, right? There's a lot to learn from Fukushima itself, right? Because when we model decarbonization scenarios, we see no way to get to 1.5 degrees C without a significant chunk of the energy mix being nuclear. There's absolutely no way to get there. If you look at Japan's energy commitments, they want to reduce, I think, by 46% emissions from the 2013 level by 2050 or 2030. There's no way you're going to get there if you don't restart your remaining 27 nuclear reactors. There's absolutely no way to get there. But there's this tremendous amount of opposition, which has to be respected, which has to be, you can't restart those nuclear reactors when 40% of the country says we don't want these, right? You have to work through that, right? But I think that's the problem that we see everywhere is, a lot of people don't realize, but Japan, which is one of the largest importers of LNG, at least from an energy policy point of view, is increasingly equating LNG as not very different than coal from its GHG impact, right? People think that that's only the Europeans that were talking about LNG and coal being in the same bucket a couple of years back until they had these issues. But increasingly, a lot of other parts of the world. So a lot of Japanese companies are rethinking this whole issue of LNG. Sumitomo, which was one of the first companies to sign up for the Cove Point LNG project here in the US, they're no longer in the business of trading LNG. Because a lot of them are under pressure from their own stakeholders and are saying that why would you be wanting to be in the LNG business and sign 20, 30-year contracts when we have these decarbonization goals? So I think globally there are lots of challenges, right? So the best thing that we can do, and this probably goes back, is every company needs to look at what can they improve on an ongoing basis. And so if I'm a natural gas producer, I'm going to be pushing very hard to say, how do we get those emissions down to 0.5%, 0.25%, 0.1%, 0.01% of my total production? Because otherwise, I don't see how the world is going to get to any of these energy transition commitments without relying on things like energy. I mean, what Maynard said is absolutely right? If somebody asked the world in 2010 that here's something that will allow you to cut CO2 emissions by 25% in 10 years in North America, that person would have won a Nobel Peace Prize. But we don't see that kind of recognition for the guys who pioneered shale gas. Right? It was a true revolution, and we just don't see that happening.
Thank you. Time for one more question. In the back again. Or, I'm sorry, let's go to the...
Hi, I'm Danielle Landers.
wait for the microphone, please, Van.
Hi, my name is Danielle Landers, and I want to thank all of you for your insights today. I'm an attorney with a focus on environmental and sustainability issues, so I had a couple of questions. One is...
If you can just make it one, we're running out of time. There are two questions.
One big question has to do with what you think the role of the both the SEC's disclosure requirements, greenhouse gas disclosure requirements, and even the Japan's greenhouse gas disclosure requirements are in helping to facilitate the transition to a greener future, either here in the U.S. or in Japan.
I hate to keep jumping in, but this is all such good stuff. We were worried, how are we going to spend all this time? And now it feels like
no problem.
We did, so, once a week we try to have an issue and a guest, and 1 week right after those regulations came out, I think we did 3 or 4 hour-long discussions on the SEC part of it. I'm less familiar with the Japanese part of it. I think what you're onto is just the best question. Because this issue and these issues, because you've got energy costs, energy reliability, you have national security, you have the environment, you've got a whole casserole here. And it's always interesting because somebody's going to be making a proposal because, this or that is the right thing. But it's always interesting to pause and say, okay, is this going to help the problem? Is this going to help the problem? What are we going to get if we do this? And so those SEC regulations, which if you're not familiar, they've asked that really all companies put in a disclosure around how climate could affect their business. With the implication being, have you planned for what climate is going to do to your business? You need to disclose that risk. So as you think about that, imagine the government said, please disclose the risk of climate to your family. Now the family sits around and you say, okay, well, let's see. So the first problem is it's going to be very subjective, right? The second problem is if you look at what the SEC is supposed to do, the SEC is really, the disclosure is if there's any risk in your company, we need to know about it. You know, like if you know, whatever, I'm thinking about your company, Nathan, but you're supposed to disclose all risks. So this is a heightened, please disclose this risk. And it's going to be very subjective. It's going to cost a lot. And one of the biggest issues I notice in companies, and we've talked about it so many times here today, information has to flow freely. People have to be willing and ready to speak. The CEO should hit to all and just think out loud. You should have that culture we saw. But if you have the government, right, because the plaintiff's attorneys are right there waiting for your disclosure. They're waiting, right? And then the legal department says, well, you know, we should hear 5 paragraphs, right? You're just going to get subjective information. You're going to get a lot of costs. You're going to get a lot of people to pucker up internally. And I don't think you're going to improve the claim. In fact, what I think is interesting is one of the issues, it's kind of like not permitting a pipeline because it's natural gas, not funding a company because it's in oil and gas, not allowing the developing world to have World Bank funding for oil and gas. All of these things, even ESG at some level, what's happening is the financial community is making energy policy. And this is what I would share with all of you. I'm on a rant. But these guys are crazy smart, right? And energy is wildly complicated for people who are in it. A fund manager who's 33, who just is a financial person, I'm sorry to pick on 33-year-old financial people, but the financial community, they're not engineers. They don't understand energy systems, they don't understand, you know. So I think that's where we have gone wrong in the last few years, is we have started to let the financial community make energy policy. And so that's a sort of indirect regulation that's happening. I think it's been really bad for the energy system. And it's really been really bad for the developing world in particular. But that was sort of you asked a fantastic question, which is like, hey, I was just wondering, does this help? And my own answer would be, I'm afraid I don't think it does.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. Just want to thank our wonderful panelists for their insights. Maynard Holt, Nathan Walker, Vidai Turaga. And our gratitude also extends to our partners, the Asia Society. Matt Fuller put a lot of time into this. Appreciate that. Consul General Munabayashi, thanks for gracing us with your remarks and your presence. The Greater Houston Partnership, Alley Energy, City of Houston, and our own Shane Graves at USJC, and Ginger Vaughn, who's put in her volunteer time for us. And the Wonder Woman behind all this, Donna Fujimoto Cole. So thank you, Donna, and thank you, everybody. And our final words come from Donna.
Okay, great. Well, first, let me just say thank you all very much. And we have a parting gift for you, and just thank you for all your expertise, your insight tonight, and your time. Thank you so much. You know, I wish we had more time for Q&A, but maybe these guys will stick around for a little while to be able to do that. But I just want to thank you all for being here, your participation and insights, and thank all of you for sitting through this great movie and for listening to these guys, because there's a lot of work that we can all do together. And I too want to thank the USJC and the Asia Society staff for putting this together. My cohort, Ginger, wave your hand up there. We made this evening possible. The City of Houston, the Greater Houston Partnership, Ally Energy, and Cole Chemical. So God bless everyone, and I hope you enjoy the evening and safe travels. Thank you very much.